In Brighton, when I was acting, singing and dancing in a kind of revue called England Our England, our director, John Dexter, brought Laurence Olivier and Joan Plowright backstage, and we met them later in the bar. Not long afterwards, I got a telephone from the National Theatre at the Old Vic saying Sir Lawrence wanted to see me. I thought it was somebody sending me up, just as I did when I was telephoned by the Variety Club of Great Britain a few years earlier to be told that I'd won their annual award, and again when 30 years later my agent asked me to call Downing Street and the lady at the other end asked me if I'd care to accept the CBE from Her Majesty the Queen. This wasn't merely mock modesty. I knew I was hardly National Theatre material. I'd no knowledge of classical theatre, hadn't even been to drama school. I had become quite well known on television and had transferred to the West End with the theatre workshop production of Alan Owen's Progress to the Park, but all this work came out of my North Country background. So, I went down to the Old Vic to meet Sir Lawrence in his office. The offices of the National Theatre were hardly spectacular, just a clutch of wooden huts in a side street at the back of the Vic. When I walked into Olivier's hut, I felt like someone who'd been summoned to the headmaster to be told he'd been accepted to a new school. I was scared, but also excited when he said something like, "Darling girl, you really must come and join us." Oh dear, I thought, what do I say now? I felt totally out of my depth. This time I was really going to be rumbled. After the interview, I rang my mother, as I always did. "Oh, that's nice, Billykins," she said. It was quite some company I was asked to join. Grouped around Olivier, there were Michael Redgrave, Diana Wynyard, Edith Evans, Max Adrian, and up-and-coming young people like John Stride, Derek Jacobi, Lynn Redgrave, Ian McKellen, Robert Stevens, Maggie Smith, Frank Finlay, Robert Lang, not to mention ardent youngsters like Michael Gambon and Anthony Hopkins, who came on to carry spears and say, "My liege." The first thing I was set to do in this company was a John Osborne adaptation of a Spanish play, but it never happened. I shall never know whether it was because John Osborne was unhappy with it or the company. It was supposed to have been directed by George Devine, who was now left with a cast of actors and no play. It was decided to do a Sophocles play, Philoctetes, as part of a double bill. That used up most of the actors, but left Rosemary Harris, Robert Stevens and myself without parts. George Devine had a friend in Paris, a fairly bizarre writer called Samuel Beckett. A play of his had just opened in Germany, which had parts for 2 women and 1 man, the perfect substitute. George quickly got in touch with Beckett, who agreed to translate play, as it was called, into English. I have taken a little poetic license with the telling of this tale. And so, some time later, I was presented with this short, extraordinary piece. I went home to read it. My first thought was, well, what the hell am I going to do with this? I had no idea what play meant. On paper, it seemed to be about a man, his wife, and his mistress, all of whom were stuck in urns. Somehow I felt the story wasn't all that important. What mattered was the way the story was presented. I read the play again. My reaction was now, don't worry if you don't understand it. Just do it fast. Rosemary Harris and Robert Stevens naturally wanted to know more about the characters they played and the meaning of the piece. I somehow felt that wasn't what mattered. The excitement would come from the musicality of the piece. None of the Beckett plays I did later had much to do with normal characterization or psychology. To me, they've all been hooks on which to hang a specific human condition. I can no longer remember how George Devine fielded all the questions that were asked about play. In any case, after we'd worked on the piece for about a week, a new element was introduced. I walked into the rehearsal room one morning and found a man in a raincoat sitting there, the author. His hair looked as though it had been crew-cut by some backstreet barber. He wore John Lennon-type glasses at the end of his nose, and that made me notice his pale, pale blue eyes and his air of intense concentration. Beckett said nothing. Sitting there in his straight-back chair, he just listened to us. George would do all the talking at rehearsal. The two men seemed to have a perfect rapport. Beckett did not talk to the actors directly. He seemed to have absolute faith in George. He also knew that George would listen to what he had to say when there was something he wished to say. After rehearsal, George gave us notes. Then Beckett would speak to us in turn in our dressing rooms. He sat down in my dressing room and at my dressing room table. This was my first private encounter with a man with whom I would work more than anyone else during the next 25 years. For about 10 minutes, he said absolutely nothing. He just pored over the script. I said nothing either. Had I asked him lots of questions, I don't think we would ever have been able to enter into the relationship we had. I soon realized Beckett was a most gentle person, a gentleman, kind, quiet, and private. Silences never worried Beckett, and they never worried me. I felt myself drawn to this man, his quietness, his concentration. He would read the text, and I have a memory of him saying, "Billie, will you bring your pencil over here and look at page 2, speech 4, 5th word. Will you make those 3 dots, 2 dots?" Working on play was not unlike conducting music or having a music lesson. As we went on, Robert Stevens and Rosemary Harris felt it was all going much too fast and that the story was interesting. Wouldn't it be a good idea to let the audience in on that story? I remember telling myself, just keep out of this, Whitelaw. I said nothing, but had the feeling that the guts of the story would come out of the dynamic rhythm of Beckett's word music. During rehearsals, Beckett never said anything personal to me. He would be correct and courteous, but he would never say, "You were good," or "You haven't got that quite right." Without anything being said, I could tell what he thought by the look on his face. I knew when I was moving towards something he wanted me to do. In fact, during all the years of working with Beckett, the only time he ever praised me directly was a whispered sentence after we'd done a television version of one of his plays. Sometimes, after rehearsal, we'd all go and sit in the pub next door to the Vic. I felt very close to George. I also warmed to the rapport between George and Sam and Jocelyn Herbert, George's lady, who was to design so many Beckett productions. Jocelyn would never interfere directly. She was simply encouraging, warm, and kind. I've come to love her dearly. She also gave me the impression that what I was doing was good, and she could do this without actually saying very much at all. At rehearsal, Sam continued to say very little. What he had to say, he said concisely. "You can't go too fast for me," was one note via George. "Don't act out the story," was another. Later, when we worked together on other plays, he would reiterate over and over again, No, that's too much colour, too much colour," clearly a euphemism for, "Please don't act." Beckett didn't come backstage after the first night to talk to the actors. As I was to learn later, he never attended his first nights, but at least we knew the play had been done the way he wanted it, and it turned out to be quite an astonishing evening. I had no idea at this time that doing play and working with Beckett was to be a watershed in my life. It would also be idiotic to claim that working with Beckett turned me overnight into a single-minded Beckett convert. I didn't even bother to read anything else he had written, but then I'm afraid it's a flaw in my character. I only tend to read plays that I've been asked to act in. My personal life at this time was not happy. By now I was past my 20s. Peter and I had been married for over 10 years. The initial phase, Peter feeling that he had to knock me into some kind of shape, had long passed. We'd moved to Datchet, a pretty village on the Thames near Windsor, and Peter's mate, Donald Pleasance, who had lived with us for many years, had moved to a house next door with his family. I had always wanted children. For whatever reason, Peter and I did not have any. I went to see gynecologists and all kind of doctors. They all agreed that there was no medical reason for this state of affairs, and I was longing for one of those doctors to say to me, "The reason you're not conceiving is because blah, blah, blah," and then put everything right. But nothing of the kind happened. Though my career continued to go well and I was never out of work, gradually I sank into a sort of hopelessness. My centre was empty, and I always seemed to be in a highly strung state. I still had that recurring feeling of emptiness when the call came in 1963 from the National Theatre. The feeling engendered by the production of play gave me back my confidence that I did have an emotional centre, if I could find it. Like so many unhappy actors before me, I now decided to concentrate on my work and to pour all my energies into my profession. On the Old Vic stage, I would now have to slug it out with people of the calibre of Olivier and Max Adrian. With Beckett and George Devine, indeed with the production of play, I found myself in a theatrical situation that mirrored the state of my own personality. I realized that my emptiness was something I could utilize. Unconsciously, I used the work as a therapy, not that I could have expressed any such thoughts at the time, but as we worked on play, it began to mean more and more to me. Others may have found it unintelligible. One day, in 1964, Peter came home and said, "I'm in terrible trouble. I've got to talk to you." I looked at him and thought, well, I think I know what this is. You've either got somebody in the family way, I can deal with that, or you've got VD and you passed it on to me. I can deal with that too. I poured him out a scotch and said, "Well, you'd better sit down and tell me about it." He said, "I think I may be in love with somebody else." That was the one thing I couldn't deal with. So I poured myself out a large gin and told him, "Perhaps you'd better go and find out whether you are or not." There now came a strange period when Peter would spend some time with the new lady in his life and the rest with me. I was still doing his washing. Finally, I told him, "Look, Peter, I think the time has come for you to decide who's going to do your laundry." So Peter took his washing away from me, and that was the end of our marriage. So here I was, unmarried and rudderless, an extremely silly, impressionable, and immature young woman. Those grey days came back to me several decades later on a cold February morning in 1995, when I went to Donald Pleasance's funeral in Putney Vale. I knew that Peter Vaughan would be at that funeral. I didn't know what on earth I would say to Peter after all this time. We found ourselves facing each other while waiting in the anteroom at the crematorium. I heard myself say, "I think we can hug each other now, Pete, don't you?" He said, "Yes, I do." And we embraced with genuine warmth and affection. A lot of old ghosts and bad feelings were laid to rest. Nearly 10 years went by before Beckett and I worked together again. But the woman who picked up the thin script of Not I that dropped on the doormat in the late autumn of 1972 was not the same actress or indeed the same person who puzzled over the script of Play. I had moved from Datchet to a large house in Camden Square, London, Northwest 1, and was living with the writer Robert Muller. Robert had written 2 television plays for me, the first of 7. He was also the father of my son, Matthew, whose birth had been my greatest joy and changed my life completely. In 1972, Matthew was just 5 years old. I was happy, my life was complete. I looked at my son with joy and love so often that I would sometimes wonder, what if something awful were to happen to him? What if he were in dreadful pain? What if a car knocked him down in front of the house? What would I do? And I went on to think, yes, I would have to kill him immediately just to put him out of his pain. I simply could not bear to think of him to be in any kind of pain or indeed to suffer in any way whatsoever. I was convinced that would be my reaction. Yet when one is confronted with a total nightmare, one somehow finds resources from somewhere to deal with it. On his birthday, I suddenly knew something was not quite right with him. Matthew sat on our bed. I ran a tepid bath for him. He didn't even have a high temperature. Suddenly he cried out, "I can't move my neck." A dreadful suspicion was now becoming certainty. As gently as I could, I carried him into the bathroom. He looked quite frightened now. "I can't look down, I can't look down," he said. By now, I knew what was wrong with Matthew. I noticed he was crossing his legs in the bath and then couldn't uncross them. I gently straightened his legs and got him out of the bath. He was still walking with his head held up. He couldn't bend it. I put him into bed. When our doctor arrived, he said, "I think we should get him to the hospital," and he wrote out a note. I asked him, "Please tell me what it is. I can deal with the known." He said, "I think it's meningitis." I said, "So do I." The doctors found that Matthew had contracted a nasty form of the disease called bacterial meningitis, but they couldn't determine for sure which of the 3 varieties it was, so they treated him for all of them. This meant 12 injections a day. Matthew was tubed and wired up, and Robert and I would take turns in bubble bashing, i.e. trying to stop the bubbles whenever they threatened to clog up one of the tubes. Dr. Herman was in charge of the unit, and he spoke very frankly with us, and I was grateful to him for that. "I don't know what your religion is," he told us, "whether you just cross your fingers or pray, but you'd better start doing it. He may not make it." Either Robert or I stayed at Matthew's bedside all the time. Matthew's nanny, Helen, took her turn too. In the hospital, my relationship with Robert changed. In some way, our energies were joined together so that they could be projected into Matthew. In doing this, the 3 of us seemed to become one entity. Sometimes it seemed to me we were creating a human being for a second time. Matthew had been in intensive care for only 2 weeks, but it took many years for him to get back to good health. A pattern had started which was to continue until he was well into his teens. We never left him in the house without either one of us being there. He had been spared, but for a while he seemed to be the victim of every virus and every infection going. During this time, everything inside me ached to give up work altogether. I remember sitting with Robert opposite Professor Strang, who looked after Matthew during this convalescent period, and telling him, "I don't want to work, really, ever again." And he said, "If you don't work, you will keep this child an invalid. If you want to do what's best for your boy, do what is hardest. Within reason, you have to behave as if nothing has happened." I like to think that the closeness that Robert and I felt during these years of Matthew's recovery helped to get Matthew well again. 6 months after Matthew came out of hospital, and it seems much longer than that, I had a phone call from the director, Anthony Page. He was about to direct a play by Samuel Beckett at the Royal Court Theatre. Could he send it round to me? I explained that I wasn't really in the market for working, something I fear I've automatically said for the past 20 years. But I said, "Sure, send it round." The script was dropped through the letterbox. I opened it up and read it through. Anthony had said, "As soon as you've read it, Billy, ring me back. We're very behind with our preparation, and I want to know whether you're interested." 3/4 of the way through it, I found I couldn't stop crying. By the time I'd got to the end of the play, 7 closely typed pages later, I couldn't even speak. Anthony Page was waiting for my phone call, but I couldn't speak. Had anyone asked me why I was crying, I couldn't have told them. Looking back, I think I understand my reaction. What hit me was an inner scream, an endless nightmare that poured out of this old woman of 70 who kept saying she was 60. In her outpourings, I recognised my own inner scream, which I'd been sitting on ever since Matthew's illness began. By this time, I'd been told that Tony wanted Glenda Jackson to play, not I. Later, I learned that Beckett had never heard of Glenda Jackson. The fact that she was a household name and had won a couple of Oscars apparently meant little to him. But Beckett had remembered our production of Play and had told Tony that he wanted me to do it. I wasn't a fly on the wall, so I shall never know exactly what passed between Anthony Page and Samuel Beckett about the casting of Not I. Beckett and I had not seen each other or written or been in any sort of contact since the production of Play 9 years previously. Yet according to John Calder, Sam's publisher in London, he had, for some reason, carried the sound of my voice around in his head. Now, not my normal voice, but the voice I used in Play. Apparently, when he wrote Not I, that was the voice he heard. A lot of the work I did for Beckett from now on seemed to derive from Not I, consisting entirely of spoken thought or of thoughts overheard, never presented in a recognisable dialogue, but taking an audience into one's most private, unformed, semi-conscious, uncensored thoughts. It also seemed to me that my character, Mouth, was not going out to an audience. The audience had to be sucked into this rioting, rambling whole. At rehearsal, Beckett was courteous but a little distant. He wanted Tony to be in charge. Yet as the work continued, I started to rehearse with Sam privately. Though we'd only worked together once, we had already developed a kind of shorthand. When we started to work on Not I in the afternoons at my home, Beckett would repeat over and over again, "Too much colour, no, too much colour," by which he meant, again, for God's sake, don't act. In Not I, as in Play, and again later when he directed me in Footfalls and Happy Days, what Beckett wanted was not the acting out of an internal thought, but the internal thought itself. He didn't want anything to be presented. As we were coming up to the dress rehearsal, I was close to my usual panic. I felt certain I wasn't going to make it. I know actors always think this, but this time it was true. A few nights earlier, I'd rung up Tony Page in despair. "It is now 3 a.m, I told him. "I've been trying to study this page for the last 4 or 5 hours. I've learned 3 lines. The more I learn, the more impossible it becomes." At the end of a night's solitary learning session, I'd try to put all I'd learned together, then pound through the lot, hoping I'd slapped on another couple of lines. But it often seemed to me that when I'd learned 2 or 3 lines more, I'd lost the equivalent number somewhere else. I thought I was going crazy. One day, as I was coming home from rehearsal, Matthew was watching an athletics event on TV. There was an Olympic clock in the corner of the screen, and I wondered if it was possible to count from 1 to 10 in time with the Olympic clock. That became my exercise, to count from 1 to 10 in a second. It had to be done with great emphasis. I had to grab at each fraction of a second. I finally taught myself to count from 1 to 10 and still be articulate. That helped. It gave me drive as well as speed. All that Not I consists of is a mouth. That's all the audience can see of the actress. No body, no face, nothing except a mouth halfway up on an invisible raised stage. Jocelyn Herbert has written in her book, A Theatre Workshop, that what Sam was after was to find out how far you can remove the body altogether from the stage, yet still end up with an intensely dramatic situation. The only way I could help was to try to eliminate Billie Whitelaw's body, then deal with what was left. What Jocelyn and Sam and Anthony were doing technically, I hoped to do emotionally. We started the dress rehearsal. After about a page and a half, I felt my starting to tumble over the edge of the rostrum. I clung onto the bar because I thought I was going to pass out. I remained convinced, as I spoke my lines, that I was tumbling off the edge of the rostrum and into the void of the theatre. I felt like an astronaut who had left his capsule. Halfway through the rehearsal, I broke down. "I'm sorry, Sam," I kept saying. "I'm so sorry." I was carried from the rostrum. I could see Sam coming down towards me. "Oh, Billy," he said, "what have I done to you?" I was given some brandy and milk, and I thought, I can't do it. It's a form of torture. It'll never work. Looking back on these rehearsal agonies, I felt that during Not I was becoming joined to Sam by some sort of umbilical cord. After work, we sometimes went to relax with Tony Page at the pub next door or the one across the square. Then there followed a short period when Sam started to stay away from the technical rehearsals. It's possible that he'd been told that Tony wanted us to work on our own without interruptions of any kind. At the end of one of those rehearsals with Tony, after Sam and I had been kept apart for a while, Tony said to me, "Sam's in the pub, off you go." I belted out of the stage door, ran into the pub, and there was Sam, sitting alone at the bar with his drink. I ran up to him like a child, grateful for being left out of school, and I said, "Thank God, I feel as though I've been separated from my mother." Sam looked at me quite shocked. "Mother," he echoed. Perhaps he would have been happier if I'd said father. I think I said mother because Sam was, to me, the source of nourishment, and I wanted to get back to that source. Before the first night of Not I, on January the 16th, 1973, I went through my own sort of mantra. Strapped into the chair, I said to myself, "Right, let your skin fall off, let your flesh fall off, let the muscles fall off, let the bones fall off, let everything fall off." I wanted to be left with nothing but my centre, my core, which seemed to be situated somewhere around my gut, the little flame which I needed. And I thought, now, keep out of the way, Whitelaw. Work with what's left. Don't get in the way of that. Pilot your own plane. Ride the turbulence. To me, every night of Not I was a first night. I do recall Sam coming up to my dressing room, sitting with me while I was getting made up. At the half hour, in a well-run theatre, all guests have to leave, and that includes the author. Sam stood up, plonked down a carton of Benson and Hedges cigarettes on my dressing table and said, "Ah, well, Billy, I'll leave you now." And then he went to the pub next door. At the end of that first performance, when I was unstrapped from my chair and lifted from the rostrum, my body still felt charged with the electricity that built up through the entire performance. I felt that if anyone touched me, they would get an electric shock. The ends of my fingers still tingled as I reached my dressing room. I didn't realize until much later that with the 2 seasons of Not I had inflamed an already damaged spine and neck. Performing in that play, all the tensions that went to the back of my neck also aggravated the vertigo and nausea I'd had in my early 20s. I've come to terms with this. The damage is something I'm stuck with. In fact, every play I did with Beckett left a little legacy behind in my state of ill health, a price I have most willingly paid. Doing Not I was to have another effect. Controlling and harnessing my feelings of terror during this play became projected onto other work I had to do. It made no difference whether I had to learn 5 lines of a voiceover or 50 pages of a play. I often became quite paralyzed with fear. I felt I had some great mountain to climb, particularly when the work in hand was relatively trivial. In the family, this became known as my Not I syndrome. It seemed that whatever I was asked to do, I imagined I would have to go through Not I again. The play had touched terrors within me that I've never come to terms with. In Sam's eyes, it seemed that I could do no wrong, yet from an ever-present sense of insecurity and inferiority, I now often tended to go in the opposite direction. I began to feel that what I'd done on the stage of the Royal Court I could not have done better, and perhaps no one else could have done it better either. I never quite solved the problem of going too fast from being a brave little North Country pit pony, as I'd been described, to becoming the mouthpiece of the greatest playwright of the 20th century. I never became quite mature enough to handle this. Part of me still clings to that pit pony, which I haven't been for a very long time indeed. Another part of me thinks I must never take on any work below the level of Beckett. No attitude for a working actress. Just before finishing the run of Michael Frayn's alphabetical order at the Mayfair Theatre, Jocelyn Herbert became rather secretive whenever we met, saying things like, "I think you'll be hearing from Sam soon about something or another." It was coming up to Sam's 70th birthday. Various preparations were being made. One night at the Mayfair Theatre, Jackie McGowan's widow, Gloria, came backstage with a little note from Sam. The first illegible sentence turned out to be, "It would be good to see you any time, anywhere, just let me know the day." Harold Pinter, who along with others had also tried to decipher this letter, handed it back to me saying, "He loves you." I was a bit taken aback. I loved him, of course, but then anyone who was close to him loved him. George Devine loved him, and so did Jocelyn Herbert, and so did Alan Schneider, who directed all his early plays in the States. To anyone who knew Beckett, it was clear that he had that rarest of qualities, total integrity. Apart from his unique intellectual and artistic gifts, Samuel Beckett also had a natural, quiet authority of which everyone who knew him quickly became aware. As a director, he didn't need to impress that authority on anyone. He certainly didn't need to shout and stamp about. Once when we were rehearsing, and he was giving notes in the auditorium at the Royal Court, there were some people at the back of the stalls getting in bar supplies. Others were clonking about with crates and trays. The cleaners were busy with the hoovers. Someone was yelling down instructions from the dress circle. Now, most directors would have stopped speaking and screamed, "I'm giving notes down here. Will you please all shut up?" Sam said nothing. He just stood there with his head slightly bowed. I found it fascinating to observe. Gradually, without him ever raising his voice or even his head, it soon became apparent to every single busy person in that theatre that Beckett needed silence so that he could give his notes. Gradually, hush came over the stalls. Everyone stopped what they were doing. It was the most extraordinary demonstration of real authority I've ever come across. What a gift, I thought. Besides that authority and artistic integrity, Beckett also had a moral integrity that I've never seen equalled in anyone before or since. He had no idea how to be untrue either to himself or to his friends. He never flattered. He showed no concern whatever with the promotion of Samuel Beckett playwright. The concept of career building was foreign to him. It wouldn't even have occurred to him to say something like, "I've got to get this play on of mine. I want to get the biggest names for it. Let's see if we can get it on in New York." The only thing that concerned him was to get his work right. And if he thought he could get it right in a hut in a back street of Lower Piddlington, that's where he wanted it performed. He didn't give a damn about being famous or getting more prizes, nor did he care for money. When he got the Nobel Prize, rumour has it that he gave most of the money away. Beckett was the easiest touch of all time. Because of his authority and integrity, I soon found that he became a yardstick for one's own decisions. Whenever we were in doubt over what to do in any given situation, any dilemma, Robert and I would often ask each other, "What would Sam do?" That was a pretty good guide to have in a quandary, although, alas, I was far from capable of following his example. Beckett had a horror of anything shallow, of publicity of any kind. Paradoxically, Beckett was quite gregarious, certainly more gregarious than I am. He'd happily go off to the pub for a pint of Guinness and an Irish whiskey with one of the electricians or prop men, particularly if that person was in some way emotionally troubled. He certainly would be happier doing that than to sit in a room full of adoring, chattering people who wanted to ask him questions about his life and work. He shied away from all that, yet he was fascinated by people's individual foibles. As I get older, I have tended to become more and more reclusive, yet when in company I usually chatter non-stop. In Beckett's sense, I'm not a private person at all. He was always private, yet not a recluse. Apart from going to pubs, he enjoyed evenings spent in the company of close friends like Jocelyn Herbert or the painter Avigdor Rica and his poet wife, Anne, Sam's neighbours in Paris. Avigdor lives on one side of the prison in Montparnasse. Sam lived on the other. Sam's flat overlooked the prison. While he wrote, he could hear the prisoners yelling and shouting and rattling their cups. Personally, I never found Beckett to be a remote figure. He needed to know or feel that people were safe. He also knew that with me it was a waste of time talking about the novels of Thomas Mann or the Lieder of Schubert. If he wanted an intellectual discussion, he would do that with someone else. In Paris, we often went for walks, strangely enough in the vicinity of a lunatic asylum. There was a little place where he liked to sit. I would hold his hand or put my arm through his. He never withdrew his hand or felt I was being familiar. We were close, but I still felt in awe of him, although in no way intimidated. I would be aware of who this man was and what he had done. I would talk to Beckett about anything that came into my butterfly mind. I might be in mid-sentence and I'd be off on a completely new track. Surprisingly, he seemed to find that quite relaxing, perhaps because the last thing I'd ever wanted to talk about was his work or its meaning. He was under no obligation to find answers, or for that matter, even to listen to me. It didn't matter. In a note he'd sent via Gloria, Beckett had mentioned that he had a little play for me. He didn't want to send it. He wanted to give it to me personally. This little play from Beckett was called Footfalls. Yours only, he wrote later, if you like it and want it. We met in Montparnasse. He said, "Would you like to go and have a meal, Billie?" By this time his eyesight was not very good, certainly not in the dark. I was expecting him to put his hand out to hail a taxi. I was still wondering about a taxi when he led me down the steps of a metro station. He simply said, No, here we are." I thought it extraordinary that he would want to go by tube, since it wasn't easy for him to go down all those steps. He looked extremely well at this time. He'd got rid of that awful scrubbing brush hair. The old raincoat had gone too. He was, in fact, very smartly dressed. He wore a soft polo neck sweater and a ginger-coloured jacket. He looked better and more cared for than when we'd done play a dozen years previously. Like many men, the older he got, the more attractive he became, at least as seen through a woman's eye. We came up the steps of another metro station and went into a bistro where he was obviously well known. He reiterated that the main thing about this play was to get the movements right, the changing of the body's posture as the play progressed, as though the character were turning slowly inward. In the crowded bistro, he started to show me exactly what he meant, taking 7 paces this way and 7 paces back, making sure that I wouldn't start on the wrong foot. Interestingly enough, no one around us took the slightest notice of all this. I wasn't embarrassed either. We would go back to the table, have a mouthful of food and a sip of wine, then get up again and walk up and down between the tables, talking animatedly. As far as we were concerned, the restaurant could have been empty. That was our first rehearsal. Though he was going to direct Footfalls himself, I realized why, for most of his plays, Beckett writes such incredibly detailed stage directions with maps and diagrams showing exactly how one should walk, how many paces to take this way or that. He did this in the hope that his intentions concerning the staging of a piece should be absolutely clear. Now that he's dead, some directors feel all that can be disregarded, alas. During the rehearsals that followed, quite soon after my visit to Paris, I asked him the only question I've ever addressed to him about any of his plays. Am I dead? He thought for a second. Well, let's just say you're not quite there. The woman existed in that ghostly spiritual halfway house between living and not living. I've often thought that when you die, it can't be possible to exist at 20 seconds past 1 and be non-existent at 20.5 seconds past 1. There has to be some sort of passage or transfiguration, a period when the body gets the message that it's dead. I used that in the play. I was aiming to convey a period between dying and grasping the message you're no longer there. Not that we ever discussed this. With Beckett, a good rule of thumb for starters is, if it ain't there, don't do it. For me, as for him, Footfalls was to be an entirely new creative experience. Sometimes I felt as if he were a sculptor, and I a piece of clay. At other times I might be a piece of marble that he needed to chip away at. He would endlessly move my arms and my head in a certain way to get closer to the precise image in his mind. Now, I didn't object to him doing this. As this went on, hour after hour, I could feel the shape taking on a life of its own. Sometimes it felt as if I were modelling for a painter or working with a musician. The movements started to feel like dance. Working with Beckett on Footfalls, I began to feel like an extension of his hands. Within the context of this required precision, I enjoyed the feelings of freedom. Whenever the shape and movements were finally right, I found that a surge of energy would start to go through me. I made a slightly off-centre curling shape, the head at an angle, the waist at another angle from the body, the spine slightly twisted. When this creature moved, it could only move in a certain predestined way. The body has its own laws. Whenever Robert saw the play, he was reminded of a sad old dinosaur. In Footfalls, I sometimes felt like a walking, talking Edvard Munch painting. Beckett was trying something new. He was no longer merely directing text. Sometimes he had doubts, and once when he came to the house he muttered to Robert, "I'm not sure whether the theatre is the right place for me anymore."